Well, hello. My name is Mark Schmeler. I'm an occupational therapist and an assistive technology professional. I have been working in the field of telehealth for quite some time now, and today we're going to be going over Module 3, which is related to etiquette and logistics associated with telehealth service delivery. With me today is Kyle Walker. Kyle, do you want to say a few things?
Sure. Thanks, Mark. Yes, my name is Kyle Walker. I currently serve as the Vice President of Rehabilitation Program Development for VGM HomeLink, but I'm an ATP and I get the opportunity to work with a variety of stakeholders from providers to payers, clinicians, and many folks over the years, including recently a lot of efforts in CRT telehealth. So thanks for having me, Mark.
Great, good to have you. So just to go over the learning objectives for this module is going to be to describe the steps in preparing for a telehealth encounter, being able to list the essential equipment requirements that you're going to need to perform a telehealth encounter, list the environmental considerations when doing telehealth, and describe appropriate telehealth etiquette and communication. So with that, I'll give it over to you, Kyle, to talk a little bit about the in-person versus remote provider.
Sure. So, I guess to start it off, as we prepare for that remote visit, oftentimes as an ATP supplier, which, can be supplemented with provider, we're often in the home with that client and or their family or caregivers. And we're going to call when the ATP supplier is in person with the client, the telepresenter. So as we're going through the preparation, we're looking at what equipment are we going to need to properly assess the needs of the client with the clinician. Looking at a pre-screen is very important, in that test call to ensure everything from logistics, the time, location, even time zone, depending upon where you're at in the country. If you're near a state border or that time zone change, that's important to identify. Again, the availability of the caregiver that is potentially going to help us out with that evaluation, understanding that all of us from an ATP supplier to the clinician to the caregiver have to operate within our scope. I think it's very important to acknowledge. As we're looking at the items from the kit itself, we're going to go through it a little bit further today and what that preparation looks like, the storage and cleaning of the equipment, to the actual connectivity and ensuring that that clinician who may be remote and the patient in the home have the bandwidth. I think there has been this topic's been debated as low as maybe 2 or 3 megs up or down for loading speed, upwards to 30. And I think the infrastructure today is a lot more robust than it has been historically. So I think we should be good there. But again, behooves us to check that as well as an emergency plan. A patient in their home is more likely not going to have an emergency plan, but it is important for you as a clinician and supplier to have some protocols in place shall a event occur. Then I think at the very least, Mark, if you would agree with me, is that why are we here? And are we on the same page with what we're going to try to accomplish with this visit? And then lastly, I would say is ensuring that everybody's on the same page, that they consent to proceed with this evaluation remotely in this type of environment. Mark, would there be anything to add for the preparation here?
Yeah, no, I think you covered that well. I'll just add that you usually by the time you're going into someone's home to do a telehealth encounter, they should have been screened. They know you're coming, and they've consented that this is the method they want to use for their evaluation. And also knowing that telehealth, and it's been covered in other modules, isn't the only method to do an evaluation. And sometimes we do a lot of hybrid, someone may be seen in a clinic first, or they may be seen at home first. It may be that they need to come into the clinic, but I think setting those goals and clarifying the purpose of the visit is important to do right up front. And I think too, just to add to your part about having a caregiver present, I think that can be something that might be overlooked, especially if you've got someone who's fairly severely immobile, and it's say it's a supplier or even a technician. In some cases, you don't want to put providers in difficult situations to do things they're not comfortable doing. So, I'll just add to this, a telehealth encounter can also be stopped at any point by any person
Sure.
if the situation is not safe.
I think
Or
that's good to say, Mark. There's always an out. And you had said it earlier is, this telehealth and these platforms to utilize as a modality to use. It's not the end all be all. It's not right for everybody. And there are other opportunities. So knowing that you have opportunities to assess the needs, I think is important.
yep. The remote provider is the person who's not with the client. And that typically could be a clinician, whether an OT or a PT or a physician. But know that there's also going to be situations perhaps where I might be a therapist going to someone's home in a very rural area, and there may not be a supplier available closely. So it could be a home care therapist consulting with an ATP at a supplier. But so in this case, when I say remote provider, it's the person who's not there. And oftentimes that would be, your physician or your therapist. So you want to make sure that you're in a private space. You have your prepare a kit. Like in our case, sometimes we ask, we have certain forms, or we ask the supplier to have them available. If we're doing an outcome measure or a self-report questionnaire, that's on hand, that they can look at. Any training materials you may want to leave with the person, or other hard copy documentation is important to know what you're going to need, that knowing what you're going to need in advance and have it ready. And then of course, access to your telehealth equipment and the peripherals, your camera, your desktop, your laptop, whatever it might be. That's typically what we do on the remote side. And I think, again, reviewing the goals of the visit, why we're doing it this way, and everybody agrees with it. It doesn't hurt to repeat that for both the remote person and the in-person provider. And then checking your connectivity, like even on your end, if you're at a medical center or in an area where you have good connection, just make sure that that's in place and it's working. And like we said before, knowing there's a backup plan if something goes wrong. The remote provider, even if they are a healthcare professional, there's not much they can do if something goes wrong. The in-person telepresenter really carries that responsibility to report if something is not right or there could be a problem. You want to make sure that they have the authority to do that. And sometimes a backup plan can be as simple as, if you lost connectivity or the bandwidth just wasn't working well that day, is there another way to communicate? And, like a landline, some people still have them, especially if they live in remote areas. For that very reason, make sure you have that phone number, or even a phone number of someone else nearby, or a neighbor if you need to seek some kind of attention.
Now, Mark, can I ask then, with experience, is there times when the ATP supplier may be remote in this scenario as the remote provider?
Yes. Yeah. Like I
So
said,
in that scenario, so if that does happen, I want to make sure that everybody knows that everybody has a responsibility and a voice within this. And from an ATP's perspective, knowing that I take a lot of ownership and responsibility in the provision of that equipment. And if there's something that I can't address with this remote evaluation, there may be another visit that I would have to maybe see that person in person if I had to. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, that's a perfect analogy. If I was a home care therapist in rural Pennsylvania here, I could dial in to an ATP supplier colleague of mine to present the case, and then that supplier could do a subsequent visit to that person's home, but having seen them remotely in advance would give them a better sense
Sure.
of what they need to bring with them. I think that's part of the challenges when you're traveling long distances, and you don't want to have to make a second trip because you didn't bring the right device to try, or a ramp to get up a couple of steps, for instance. So
Well,
that's another
agreed.
scenario.
And that's actually, I think, a good segue into the next slide with the equipment kit.
Yeah.
So when we look at the equipment, and I'm coming at it from a perspective of an AT supplier, but it could also be ambiguous to that provider if they're the ones, the clinician in person. I look at it from the perspective that I want to be as prepared as possible, knowing that there are some limitations towards what I can bring to the visit. Now, there is some structure and framework to that. When we look at this remote assessment, going down the line of your smartphone or tablet, your communication software, that's essentially what that is, right? The platform's already installed. Are you holding it, or do we have a mounting type device? My 2 cents are that you have a mount that's set on the ground or a table when we're looking at that patient and their needs. We talked about the connectivity a little bit. There may be value to bring in I'm gonna, not a selfie stick, but a selfie light to have proper lighting and a backup battery pack. They are relatively inexpensive, that in case your battery is drained down on your tablet and or your device you're using, that you have a backup plan for that. The other things I would also recommend, which is pretty normal in terms of the expectations, is these assessments and evaluations can be done for new equipment. They can also be done for maybe repairs and or modifications. So having that proper equipment prepared, again, Mark, you had mentioned earlier that pre-screen, how important it is knowing that we're not going in here blind and using this technology advantageous to us and I guess every stakeholder involved in this scenario. Everything from your toolbox, from your multimeter to the demo equipment, from your backs and cushions, perhaps even a couple different chairs, if that's what we're looking at for this patient from a seating and positioning perspective. Mark, anything you would add to this slide?
Yeah, no, just that treat it just like any visit to the home. Like you said, it could be a visit for a new device, but the old device has, some minor maintenance or repair that needs to be done to it. The client could be complaining that their arm pad is loose, and if you have your toolbox there, you can just fix that right away. Versus saying I did not bring my tools with me, or I don't have them.
Agreed.
It's let's make the most effective use of the situation and just have things on hand. We sometimes call this a basic equipment package that everybody should have on their truck or van. No different than a firefighter or an EMS worker. You just should have this with you. One of the things I will mention is smartphones versus laptops. The smartphone has really advanced a lot, and I think in many instances that's kind of the device of choice. Just be aware that the person you're serving directly with may not be able to see that small screen. For them, it may be important to see the remote provider's face and so forth. So that's just something to take into consideration. But I also found, making sure the battery is charged. So it's an unfortunate situation, maybe the last visit of the day and you've been on your phone all day, which is, that's what we do when we're traveling, but keeping it charged so that you don't have to suspend the appointment after all the resources have been put in place to make that encounter happen. There's a lot of coordination. As I say, it's an unfortunate situation when you have to suspend the telehealth visit because you forgot to charge your batteries or you didn't have a backup battery pack or something. So
sure.
It sounds like common sense, right? But we've seen that happen, and we've seen people forget their tools, for instance, or forget to bring a portable ramp to get a device into the home.
Well, and I've been guilty of it. I'm not perfect. We won't go through those examples today, but you did say something, Mark, that I want to plant the seed because I think we're going to talk about it a little bit later on. And having that visual of the remote provider, and how do we continue to try to humanize what we're doing in these remote environments? I think that's a very key piece of that. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. So very, very good point there, Mark.
Mm-hmm.
So on the environment piece, and Mark, I'm happy if you'd like to chime in at any time as well. I think aside from setting up the pre-screen, making sure we're there, knowing what we're going to assess, how it's going to be done, the tools needed, but where it's going to be done. That environment itself, I think, is a very important piece of that as it pertains to the safety of all individuals and really that enclosed environment. And I mean that from the perspective of a bad situation would be where someone is sitting in an open space, not a private space with a closed door surrounding where there's passerbys that are inadvertently partaking in the evaluation. That is not a good environment. We need to have a very controlled environment as much as possible for the security of the documentation, but also from the client perspective and the details of the assessment. When you look at even details as much as lighting, all of us in light of the public health emergency and telehealth platforms have to be aware where that light's coming from. For example, in my office behind me, you will see a window, but the blinds are closed. If I shall open that, it would make a very difficult viewing for the audience on this module. So looking at those things and making sure that light's in front of you. And the noise is a huge thing. That's one other important reason why we need to have a close, secure environment. There are not a lot of background noises. Now, within these remote evaluations, more than likely, we're not going to have a headset on the patient or the telepresenter. So it will be a speaker type device that we're using. So any reduction we can take to prevent any of that background noise in a non-busy area, I think is very good. The last piece, that device portability, knowing that some of the silver lining and the benefits of doing a telehealth type visit are that we can see that environment. If it is in the home, for example, we can see the kitchen, the bedroom, the bathroom, those living environments that historically we couldn't see before. So having that device be portable to look at those different environments and how the client maneuvers through those environments, I think is a very important part, Mark.
Yep.
Would you add anything else to that?
No, I think that's where, portability of like a tablet or a smartphone. Again, the smartphone has been a godsend in providing this, especially, like when we do it, it's like, okay, now give me, I'll say the client, is it okay if the telepresenter gives us a walking tour of your home? And, you can put the light on if the lighting's not good. There's just a lot of opportunities there. But some other things, it's great to be at someone's home remotely, to see things that we would not see in the clinic. But we also know, hey, it's reality. So noise, for example, you may have to, it may not be as noticeable if you're in person, but a TV on in the background, like a family member watching television with the volume turned up. You may have other people having conversations. We just want to remind people if we could keep the environment as quiet as possible, but at the same time, we don't want to be too intrusive, and we want to see what's really going on. So if
I agree.
some of that's reality, then we have to deal with it.
Well, I think that's a very valid point, Mark, is understand that this is not perfect. However, there are some things that are within our control, and I will tell new technicians, ATPs, suppliers, and providers coming into this space is do as much as you can to control what you can control. Once you get outside of that controlled environment, there's a lot of unknowns. When we live in the Midwest, the weather, for example, if I'm going out to visit a client, there's a lot of things outside of our control. So how do we set that up so that we can at least mitigate those risks? I think going through those protocols, Mark, are very good.
Yep. Yeah. And again, planning, be flexible, have the stuff there ready to go, because you never, no matter how much you screen the situation, you never know what you're going to encounter. So it's just good to have your basic equipment package ready to go.